Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second hour of the Santita Jackson Show, right here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. But also, this is my Facebook show. We're doing both, really, at the same time. We're looking, you're here on the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. You're also on Twitter at Santita J, or is it X now? And then, of course, the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Everybody on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel, please like and subscribe, like and subscribe, like and subscribe. We're kind of bumping up against the show that I'm already recording, so make sure you go to the Santita Jackson. Hey, 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 girl, easy peasy. Sending you so much love, my girl. I love you, Bernadette, and easy peasy. Come on. And everybody, like and share the show. Like and subscribe on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. And please like and share on Facebook. Let everybody know about the show. And here we go, everybody. Here we go. And my handle on X is at Santita J. We're streaming there now. And on Instagram at Santita Jackson IG. Have to give you all those things. That's right. So, Julian Assange, I don't know about you, but we've been waiting for him to be released. He has been held in captivity for years. And we were wondering what was going to happen and if he was going to be released, if he was going to be brought back to the United States. And quite frankly, those of us who have supported him, and I'm a talk show host, I'm not a journalist, so I can tell you how I feel about this. I've just always seek to be fair. We were worried that just given the powerful forces arrayed against him, that he would not meet a good fate were he brought back to the United States. And that's to put it very, very gingerly. But lo and behold, he has been released. There was a plea deal worked out, and we need to know what the plea deal is about. There's some reports that say that part of the plea deal was that he had to destroy some documents. Is that true? If so, what did he have to destroy? And just how is he doing? Because the concern has been about his health. If you look at him, you can see that he does have some health struggles. So let's get right to it. Of course, Dwight McKee came on over from the previous hour, but brilliant social scientist, Dwight McKee, dean of the Ma'afa Redemption Project, of course, senior advisor to Dr. Cornel West. Indeed, Dr. Cornel West says that Dwight McKee is his mentor. Such is his brilliance. And Chip Gibbons, so brilliant, so dedicated. You have been in the courtroom with Julian Assange. And in fact, you've spoken to us from London. So come on, talk.
Yes.
Absolutely. So what happened? I thought you were on your way back there. And then we find out, oh, the plea deal's been worked out, which we'd heard rumors of, right? So talk to me. What happened here?
There had been rumors of a plea deal, but the defense denied that there was any serious offers from the Department of Justice. What it appears happened, there's sort of dueling pieces of supposedly inside information in the Washington Post and the New York Times. The Washington Post claims, having spoken to a number of Department of Justice officials, that the Department of Justice was very concerned it was going to lose the appeal in July in the UK. That in the appeal process in the extradition process in the UK, it's very strange. The UK government represents the US government, so there's UK government lawyers. Apparently, the UK government's lawyers had told them at this point, given the court's concerns, and I'll talk about those in a minute, and the likelihood of prevailing, that they thought it was unethical to continue the appeal. A number of people from the DOJ in the US and Virginia had dropped off the case for their own concerns. So there was a number of internal concerns about where this case was going. And Julian Assange, this has been going on for 14 years. A lot has happened over 14 years. So it can be tough to keep track of. But what happened was in 2010 and 2011, WikiLeaks, working with a number of mainstream news outlets, released a number of documents about the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, about the actions of the State Department, as well as about the U.S. prison at Guantanamo Bay. All of these documents came from a whistleblower, Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning was an Army private. She became very disturbed by the reality of what war was like in Iraq. She thought the American people had a right to know what war looked like, and that if we understood what she called 21st century asymmetrical warfare, that the late Dan Ellsberg famously said that is a euphemism for what we used to call colonial warfare, wars where one side has planes and the other side does not, that they would be horrified and they would have a public debate. So she gave these documents to WikiLeaks. She was arrested, prosecuted, put in jail, served more time in jail for anyone at the time for giving information to the media. She had an unusually harsh and long sentence for what she was convicted under.
Hold on, let's make clear, because Chelsea Manning was mistreated.
Yes.
In prison.
Chelsea Manning was held in conditions during the pretrial phase that are worse than the conditions that people on death row faced. The cell was smaller. A United Nations expert, the then Special Rapporteur on Torture, Cruel, Degrading, and Inhuman Treatment, Juan Mendez, concluded definitively that Chelsea Manning had suffered cruel, degrading, and inhuman treatment, and that it was possible that the level of treatment arose to the level of torture, but without conducting a interview of Chelsea Manning, without the government listening in, he could not conclude definitively one way or the other. The Obama administration refused to allow a confidential interview between the special rapporteur and Manning. So Chelsea Manning, under international law, was held under cruel, degrading, and inhuman treatment, and there is strong likelihood to believe that had the Obama administration allowed the interview to go through, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture would have concluded that she was tortured. It was a military court. The military court judge also found Chelsea Manning was mistreated during this phase of her detention. He didn't rule she was tortured, and he gave her 112 days of time served to her sentence, an extra 112 days. I'm not sure. I'm glad they recognized it, but the idea that you've been tortured, you get 112 days off your 35-year sentence is rather cold comfort at that point. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison. That is an unprecedented sentence. I believe it still is. Obama, many people think he pardoned her. He commuted her sentence to a lesser sentence. She was still in prison when he left office, even though he had commuted her sentence. She didn't go free right away. So her sentence was 35 years. It was commuted to 7 years. No one had ever been sentenced to anything that long for giving information to the media. Following the persecution of Miss Manning, Julian Assange became very convinced that he would be prosecuted in the U.S. During this time, there are 2 serious allegations of sexual misconduct against him in Sweden. Julian Assange cooperates with the investigation in Sweden initially. There's a lot of information saying he did not cooperate. He's never charged. It never gets beyond a preliminary investigation phase. At some point, Assange leaves Sweden. He is not a Swedish citizen. And while in the United Kingdom, the Swedish government, which had already interviewed him because he made himself available for an interview in Sweden, decides he needs to be interviewed additionally. Further interviews, again, still not charged, and seek his extradition. Julian Assange agrees to return to Sweden if they agree to not send him to the U.S. At this time, there is concern the investigation is a ruse. Julian Assange's request has been deemed reasonable or correct by 2 different groups of United Nations experts. First, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, then the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, the subsequent one. So not Juan Mendez, but Niels Meltzer, who takes over when Juan Mendez's term is over. We've been through 3 different special rapporteurs on torture over the 14 years we did this. So there's 3 people involved. They all agree that Sweden has an obligation under an international legal principle that has a fancy French name, I believe, non-refoulement, which basically just means you cannot send a refugee or someone to be tortured. that Sweden has an obligation to respect it. Sweden refuses to respect it. We know now that the Australian government concluded from Sweden's refusals not to send them to Australia, or not to send them to the US, they believe it was likely. At this point, we now know through the work of journalism Stefania Morici, through filing FOIA requests, that the Swedish government considers dropping their request to question Julian Assange, but the British government pressures them not to, saying don't get cold feet. Why would the British government ask Sweden not to drop a request for questioning and preliminary investigation? Your guess is as good as mine. The inference has always been that this was an attempt to trap him or turn him over to the U.S. Obviously, sexual misconduct is a serious allegation, but there are unusual acts of misconduct during the investigation. Assange receives asylum from Ecuador, who believes he's likely to be sent to the U.S. He goes to the Ecuadorian embassy, and at this point, the British police spend tens of millions of pounds surrounding the embassy so he cannot go to Ecuador. At one point, they talk about storming the embassy, which is an act of war under international law. Thankfully, they back down from this. And then Sweden finally interviews Julian Assange in the embassy, and they drop the investigation, at which point the UK, at the request of the White House, Trump is president at this point, brings a bail skipping charge against Julian Assange. So they can continue to say they'll arrest him if he makes his way to Ecuador, where he has a legal right to go. He's been granted political asylum. In 2019, I know we're going through a lot of history. Julian Assange is finally charged, all for information relating to the Chelsea Manning documents. Obviously, WikiLeaks has done a number of other releases, some of them quite controversial. No one was ever charged for any of those. This was never about Hillary Clinton's emails. This was never about the CIA hacking tools. This was only ever about documents they got in 2010 that the New York Times and The Guardian published that were about war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, prisoners at Guantanamo, and backroom deals of the State Department. And Julian Assange faces this unprecedented 18-count indictment. One of the counts is that he alleged he conspired with Chelsea Manning to violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Another charge was that he conspired with Chelsea Manning to violate the Espionage Act. And then there are 16 more charges brought under the Espionage Act. Some of these are charges for Chelsea Manning having given him the documents, alleging he aided and abetted her. Some of them are charges for Julian Assange having received the documents, and some of them are charges for Julian Assange having published them. Essentially, what they did was they took a relationship between a journalist and his source and transformed it into a criminal conspiracy. So in order for a journalist to publish information from a whistleblower, the whistleblower has to give him the information, which Julian Assange is charged with twice, once as a co-conspirator, then as a aiding and abetting. And I think it's wrong to charge a whistleblower with giving information to a journalist. I think it's even more bizarre and wrong to charge the journalist for the whistleblower having done so. Then he's charged with receiving the information, and then he was charged with publishing the information. In July of this year, Julian Assange was expected to have an appeal. This extradition has gone through the UK court system for the last 5 years. Initially, a judge blocked the extradition. It was reinstated. And then Julian Assange was granted another appeal. It was a very narrow appeal, and it all came from the fact that Gordon Kromberg, who is the lead prosecutor on this case and has been involved in a number of infamous political persecutions, including of Samuel Arian, a Muslim American activist, Daniel Hale, a drone whistleblower, told the courts that the U.S. might try to argue that as a foreign national, Julian Assange did not have First Amendment rights. It's fascinating because the UK court basically found that Julian Assange didn't have any free speech protections or free speech arguments, but that he couldn't be denied them on the basis of his nationality. And the U.S. refused to back down from this. And we know now from the Washington Post that their own attorneys were telling them they were going to lose this appeal. So they finally agreed to a plea deal with Julian Assange. He pled guilty to a single count under the Espionage Act. This is the conspiracy provision of the Espionage Act. To violate the conspiracy provision, you have to violate with one other person or more another provision of the Espionage Act. So essentially, the conspiracy, as I read it, is again, Chelsea Manning gave him documents and he received them. It's possible the conspiracy covers publishing them. It's ambiguous in the there was no indictment because there was no grand jury. There was something called a criminal information, but that is the same as an indictment. But at the end of the day, the conspiracy that Julian Assange was pled guilty to was that he was a journalist who received information from a source and he published the information. As Julian Assange told the judge at his hearing, and he flew to the Northern Marianas Islands because he was afraid to come to the continental U.S., both because he thought the U.S. might do something duplicitous and he was afraid he might face physical harm. It was revealed that the CIA plotted to assassinate him, which is very troubling. So it makes a lot of sense that he would not want to come to Virginia, as lovely as Virginia may be. He said, working as a journalist, I encouraged my source to provide information that was classified in order to publish that information. I believe that the First Amendment protected that activity. I believe the First Amendment and the Espionage Act are in contradiction with each other, but I accept that it would be difficult to win such a case given all these circumstances. So I believe you're going to have Kevin Gostola on later today. Is that my imagine?
Right behind you. Guilty of journalism.
Kevin wrote a book with the title Guilty of Journalism. I called Kevin the day of the plea deal and said, well, Kevin, you certainly picked the correct title for your book because in the end, he was guilty of journalism. And for those of us who worked on this for years, they told us it wasn't about journalism. It was about hacking. It was about this. And I have read their criminal information, which is in lieu of an indictment, zero mention of hacking. I have read the plea agreement, which has a statement of facts, no mention of hacking. The Department of Justice on their website put a press release that again levied the accusation against Julian Assange he was engaged in hacking, but they completely dropped that for this charge. They completely dropped that for this plea agreement. So for years, when people like myself and probably you who defended this as a First Amendment thing, people would attack us and say, oh no, this is about hacking. This isn't about journalism. In the final conclusion of this case, every single one of the false hacking accusations were dropped and Julian Assange was guilty of journalism. You asked me, how is Julian Assange doing? I don't have great personal insight into beyond what's in the public at this moment, and if I did, I couldn't share it. But I will say this: I was at virtually the October, I guess it was 2021 hearing where Julian Assange was on a virtual connection for this UK court hearing, and everybody commented on how sickly he looked, not like terrible, like he looked like he was dying.
He looked ill. Yeah,
he looked incredibly ill, and we learned 2 months later he had a stroke that day, a mini stroke. So I was on the virtual court hearing where Julian Assange was sitting there having had a stroke. And I will never forget how concerned we all were, how other journalists who had covered the case, who had visited him, were shocked. And, we also know the CIA had a plot to stop him from leaving the UK, where they were willing to, if he got to an airport, have a sniper. This was all reported in Yahoo News. Yeah. Have it kill him was the first part, but have a sniper shoot the tires out of the airplane. They had all these other ideas they would do first. They would shoot at the car. They'd crash another car into the car. But if somehow after all of this, he got to an airport, London Heathrow Airport, and got in a plane, they were ready to shoot at the plane, to shoot the tires out. And to watch Julian Assange looking much healthier than he did the day he had a stroke, with his attorneys, Jen Robinson. I know Jen. I messaged her while she was on the plane with him, and Barry Pollock, a U.S. attorney, to watch him walk on that plane looking much healthier, not in handcuffs, not with snipers shooting at him, walking on that plane basically a free man, knowing he was going to his freedom, was incredible to watch. And to watch him land in Australia when the prime minister calls him, even in the U.S. media, they've described what happened in Australia as a hero's welcome. Meeting his wife and his father on the tarmac, it was incredibly moving to watch, because you put it quite gingerly, as you said. There were moments, especially after that stroke, where I did not think he was going to live to even be extradited. I mean, forget about what happens if he comes here. I didn't think he'd make it long enough to even be sent here. I was at the hearings in the court in February and May, and they had an iron cage sitting in the courtroom in case he came and he would sit there. But he was too sick to come to court because he had broken his ribs. And the last time I was on, you asked me how did he break his ribs, and I had no idea. I honestly didn't, and I have since discovered he has really severe osteoporosis from being in the embassy, and he has a constant cough. I also have a chronic cough. He has a constant cough, and he broke his ribs coughing. Like, that's how bad his health was. He was breaking his ribs coughing, and could not come to court. And it's great to know that he is finally free. I mean, he has been in some form of captivity for 14 years. He spent 5 years in Belmarsh prison. It is one of the harshest prisons in the UK, is a maximum security prison. One of his fellow inmates was I don't think this was ever published, but I learned this from the family, was a convicted cannibal. That's the type of person he was being housed with, a convicted cannibal. Not an alleged cannibal, a confessed and convicted cannibal. And prior to that, he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, and the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention ruled that was an unlawful form of arbitrary detention carried out by the UK and Swedish governments, and that they owed him reparations. They owed him compensation. Of course, Britain is not going to compensate Julian Assange. Sweden is not going to compensate Julian Assange. The US is not going to compensate Julian Assange. But it's really important to be clear that people, I think, have this image of him hiding out in the embassy or having a great time there. He was, according to the United Nations Working Group, arbitrarily detained in this embassy, and according to a United Nations Special Report on Torture, subject to psychological torture while he was in the embassy. So this is someone who has been prosecuted lawfully, lawful in quotations, detained unlawfully, tortured, the subject of an assassination plot, the subject of a kidnapping plot, had failing health, and he is now free in Australia. I don't know what's next for Julian Assange. He has not made he's not made any public appearances. His family has stated he wants privacy and time to recover. Obviously, anybody who has been through a 14-year ordeal like that deserves privacy. They need the time to recover. If he has given so much in his fight to create a more just world, to defend press freedom, that I don't see how anyone can ask anything more of him. If he just takes the rest of his life to recover, that's totally understandable. If he does come back and joins us in the fight for press freedom, that's great too. We'll see what he does next.
Well, I mean, what else can he do? He's done, he's given. And before we bring on Kevin Costello, let me bring him on before you go, so that you can at least say hello. And I'd love to before you go, hear Dwight McKee.
Hey, Jim.
Hey, Kevin.
Kevin Costello, how are you? It's so wonderful seeing you. I wanted Dwight McKee to be here, and he is here. Kevin Costello, of course, from The Dissenter. The book, Guilty of Journalism. How brilliant, how brilliant, how brilliant. I urge you to get it. He's one of the few people among us who witnessed the 68 convention, because he was the youth director for Operation Breadbasket and then Operation Push under Reverend Jesse Jackson. So he knows all the people all of Dr. King's lieutenants. He worked for them and was trained by Reverend James Bevel and Reverend C.T. Vivian and Reverend Hosea Williams and Reverend Jesse Jackson. And he knew Fred Hampton. He and some of our people went looking for Bobby Rush so that the FBI would not kill him in the nights following the murder of Fred Hampton. We knew that the police had killed him, all of that. So he has a lot of experience with this. And we've seen um, the need for independent press, black press, so that we can get our stories told. So when I see what's happening to Julian Assange, when we see it from that perspective. Dwight, given what you've heard from Chip Gibbons, and he has always been such an admirer of you and your work.
Thank you.
Dwight, why don't you give us your comment?
Well, first, let me commend Chip for the investment of time and energy and safety in overseeing this process. I'm sure she was a great comfort to himself and the family. Her commitment to making sure that this thing didn't get lost to the public. Uh, his biggest threat was his commitment to the truth. And in a society that is built on lies and deception, the biggest enemy becomes the truth. And so his commitment to journalism and pure journalism and not being compromised by the usual trappings of corporate media has made him, in many people's opinion, including mine, international hero for all of the ages. He represents a dynamic that now, in many ways, are missing in journalism, and that is to put your whole life, your whole being, your whole family's lives on the line to tell the truth and to pursue justice and to make sure that the real story is told. And I'm sure who has the greatest admiration for him are the family of those people who they shot and killed in cold blood, which is the story that he got out, that they really punished him for having gotten out. But those family stories need to be told. And so this is not a new story.
Mm-hmm.
This is a news story, but it's not a new story.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the basic pillars of democracy is a free and active press. And you really can't have that unless you have people committed to the truth and who are willing to put their lives on the line to tell that truth. And so when you look at guys like Daniel Ellsberg, you look at guys like the Watergate guys,
Oh, you're talking about Woodward and Bernstein.
Woodward and Bernstein. Mm-hmm. You look at guys who really sacrificed so much to get the real story out. We are not just dependent upon those guys. We have an obligation to try to protect and elevate those guys, because ultimately, our the whole democratic process is dependent upon guys like that who have made that kind of commitment. So, Chip, again, I want to applaud you for having been so committed to that and so committed to having that story not be lost.
Policy Director for Defending Rights and Dissent. And of course, your friend and colleague, Kevin Gosztola, is here. I urge you, the dissenter, it is worthy of your support, as is Defending Rights and Dissent. Because indeed, that is a matter that is before the court today. I think we are really in the formation of yet another republic in the United States. You know, France is on its fifth, or second or third. You know, after the Civil War, that was another republic. The breaking of apartheid, yet another republic. This is just my opinion. And we are asking some fundamental questions now, Chip and Dwight and you, Kevin, guilty of journalism. Journalism, as I understand it, is the only protected profession in our Constitution. Chip, before you go, A closing.
Yes.
What is your closing thought? What do you want
Thought
us
is
to?
Kevin's book title. I broke. Sure. I think
Oh,
I'm breaking up. I'm
yeah,
back. Okay.
you're back.
I mean, I think the closing thought is Kevin's book title is correct. Julian Assange was found guilty of journalism. This is a case about somebody who exposed great abuses of power, war crimes, state criminality. None of the people who committed those war crimes ever went to prison. Not Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld for launching the war. Not the individuals who carried out the airstrike that killed the two Reuters journalists. The only people who were imprisoned were Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, which is very sad. But Julian Assange walks free. Chelsea Manning is free now. A lot of people didn't think either one of them would ever experience freedom again, that they would both about the rest of their days in captivity. That's not the case, and that is the result of a lot of activism and a lot of pressure. I don't think the U.S. government gave up of its own accord. It was a pleasure to join you. I do have to run now, and good to see you always, Kevin and Santita.
Thank you for making the time for us today, because I know everyone wants to speak with Chip Gibbons, Policy Director for Defending Rights and Dissent. All my love, my beloved Chip. Kevin Gastol, you're my beloved too. Guilty of journalism. Wow, this is the only protected profession in our Constitution. And yet, the people who we see in corporate media, it has now been documented that many of them the biggest people have ties to our intelligence community. Mm-hmm. And you see this in the opinions that are able to be transmitted across corporate media, and what's being blocked out. So, guilty of journalism. Why don't you explain to us who Julian Assange is? What we're not hearing.
What we're not hearing is that Julian Assange did basically what any journalist does. We still haven't been able to break through and get even the people who are the hosts or the anchors of these media shows to admit, although they oppose prosecuting Julian Assange, what they won't admit is what was laid out in clear detail during this case by Assange's lawyers, which is that he's taking this information, he's looking it over, he's trying to understand what these documents are about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. He's looking at documents about how the U.S. does diplomacy or foreign policy, learning about what is happening between the U.S. and 150 plus countries around the world. And then he's finding newspapers, he's finding journalists, he's finding people in countries that are going to be impacted by these revelations, and he's giving them that information so that their local news organizations can publish stories that will benefit their people. This is media democracy in action, if you have any appreciation for that concept, which is that information can give people the power to then take action so that they can better their lives.
So what kind of effect has the treatment of Julian Assange had on corporate media and on independent media?
So the effect on corporate media hasn't been that significant. They've basically shrugged it off. And all along, they've told themselves a lie that they were different. And I've got news for them. If we, for some reason, are seen to be living under a second term of Donald Trump, some of these journalists who have done journalism that has been going after President Donald Trump and his cronies, they're going to probably find that they're in a similar position to Julian Assange, because we know that Donald Trump and his people will treat even just, I don't know that you know this name. I don't know that your listeners know this name, but there's a national security correspondent for the New York Times named David Sanger. Mm-hmm. And he's done journalism against Donald Trump. What's to stop the government, the U.S. Justice Department, from weaponizing the law and going after those people. And you think that they're off limits. They've thought all along, Julian Assange, exception to the rule. It's never going to happen. But that all depends on who's in power. It all depends on who is who is running everything from the White House. And so if that changes and they're the enemy, they can be targeted because of this case. Independent media, this makes it terrible for independent media. It says how vulnerable you are. Alternative press, the people who go out there on the streets all the time and cover protests. I mean, we've seen what's been happening with people who go to campus protests to cover these students who are speaking up against the war on Gaza. We've seen what are happening to all of these people who go out when everyone's saying, this is a movement for Black lives. We need to organize. You see people getting shot in the eyes who are out there trying to report and share images of what's going on in the streets and these injuries that people have suffered. But it gets worse for independent journalists because this gives the government a capacity to basically decide who is and who is not a journalist. And that is nothing that our government should ever have. But we know that they have tried to exercise that kind of power for over 100 years. If we understand the context, if we understand history, we understand that this thing of disloyalty, of you're a traitor, you're a treason, you're not truly American, that's been a language that's always been spoken. And they tried to do this with Julian Assange. The problem here for them, though, is Julian Assange is not an American citizen. So you can't talk about Julian Assange as a traitor because he doesn't owe the United States any allegiance. He owes the world, if any place, an allegiance. And, it's up to him if he wants to be a nationalist and have allegiance to Australia, his home country, who just did a lot to save him from coming here for a big, giant trial. But Julian Assange owes the U.S. nothing. And I'd say to anyone who has ever been frustrated with Julian Assange's politics that you need to get over it because he does not have to support any pillar of this democracy that we put forward as the leader that should run the United States. I mean, that applies for Donald Trump. That applies for Hillary Clinton. It applies for Joe Biden. It applies for anyone. If he opposes those people, he does not have to support them. He can do journalism that is adversarial and challenges elites in this country, knowing that it's never going to be a matter that he has to vote in or deal with. I think that was always frustrating for U.S. media because Julian Assange did not have to be a part of the system that he was challenging with these documents. That said, I'll end my point here by saying something that doesn't always come through. WikiLeaks has been put in the crosshairs because there's this perception that it is only about challenging the United States. It actually has published a wide range of documents outside of just the United States, exposing Syria, exposing Russia, exposing a lot of various countries. The first leak that got it notoriety back in 2007, I believe, had to do with Kenya and corruption in that country. So it is not just about bringing down the United States. It is about showing us what the world is doing, giving us an avenue for activists, human rights attorneys, etc., to share information with the world, for whistleblowers to have an outlet for publishing information so we can arm ourselves with knowledge.
Of course, we're talking with Kevin Gosztola of thedissenter.com. Please go give them your support. You can get a lot of great information, but you got to get the book, Guilty of Journalism. Guilty of Journalism. This is the only protected profession in our Constitution. It is crucial to the preservation of the Republic, the strengthening of it, and it protects the elements of our government that are democratic as we seek to make the government more democratic. If you don't have a free and open press, we don't have this American project. The Espionage Act. It seems that only left-wing activists are prosecuted under that. And I want you to help us to explain why he was prosecuted under that and why he exposed illegalities. Why is that wrong?
Yeah, exactly. And he's exposing that the U.S. government will go to great lengths to interfere in even its allies' courts. They'll go into Spain, they'll go into Germany, and they'll pressure prosecutors so that they drop charges against US soldiers or CIA agents that were involved in torture, rendition, or actually executing, killing journalists or killing people in cold blood that were civilians. And they went to great lengths to do this. This was exposed. And the reason why Julian Assange was charged under the Espionage Act was because something like Assange, something like WikiLeaks, the what they symbolized was a threat to US power. And so the people in our national security institutions, those in our military, they determined that if there is this place where whistleblowers can go, where media sources can go and provide information about what the US military and what these agencies do daily, then that is a threat to getting people to go along and get along with the United States. And, you know, in order for us to do a lot of what we do, in order for the US to get away with a lot of what it does, there has to be this narrative of believing that it is just this supporter of freedom, democracy, and human rights. But when you peel back the curtain and you look behind it and see what's true, there's a lot of evidence that says we have a long, long way to go. If in fact that's even the values and principles that the people in our government are trying to go after. And I think that's hugely debatable. But if you think that that's what they're about, we are not doing it. And WikiLeaks exposed that and made it difficult. And that's why they were prosecuted. And the Espionage Act, going after left-wing activists, going after people who challenge the government, basically. I mean, when you look at what Woodrow Wilson wanted to use the Espionage Act for,
Which
was going after people who are anti-war, going after people who were saying to the US government, we do not want you to get involved in World War I. We think that we should stay out. And that was such a threat. And then they're using the Espionage Act to go after Black newspapers that are sending it in the mail service, you know, sharing their own zines. That's how we would probably understand it today, sharing their own alternative publications. And they're going after people who are either socialist or communist. You know, this is a precursor to what got even more ugly later on, where you had Senator Joseph McCarthy hauling people in before a House Un-American Activities Committee hearing. Daniel Ellsberg's the model case under this Espionage Act for punishing whistleblowers. I'm so upset that he's not here to join us in celebrating the freedom of this figure, because he sadly died of cancer last year. But we should understand that Daniel Ellsberg's legacy is basically that he stood up to this government and survived in almost the same way that Julian Assange has just survived, because there was so much corruption in Daniel Ellsberg's case that they couldn't complete it. But they were going to. The court, there was nothing that said the court couldn't convict Daniel Ellsberg of a crime simply because he exposed the truth of the Vietnam War. And in Julian Assange's case, we have evidence from the Washington Post that it flat out collapsed, that the US prosecutors bungled their job, and they probably should all be fired because they were handed a task by these national security state people, and they were told what to do, and they failed. And we're lucky that they failed, in the same way that we're lucky that they failed in getting Daniel Ellsberg. But with that, we learn our lessons and we move forward. And we tried to build off this movement that gave us a victory to free somebody who represented freedom of the press. And we have to expand that out to cover more people. I mean, I also think we look at this movement, and I've had some conversations with various people who have thought, well, does this mean that we have some momentum to free some other people who the state has imprisoned right now that need to be free, political prisoners that we need to see free, like Mumia Abu-Jamal, like Leonard Peltier, like these people who have been causes for a long time? Does any of this filter over into those cases so that we can take action finally and get them out of the clutches of this US government? And I think that's a fair question. I think people who see the success with Julian Assange are right to say, well, why can't these other people not be going through this injustice as well?
So we're talking with Kevin Gosztola. Get the book, Guilty of Journalism. Guilty of Journalism. It is a magnificent read, and it really helps to shape really what we're seeing every day. Because what is most easily accessible to those of us who are a little older would be corporate media. But it's interesting, young people, your age and younger, they don't look at corporate media. They now get your news from independent media, to the extent that we can still get, if the algorithm doesn't get you, and typically they do, when you go on social media, that's where we're getting our news now. And, it's also controlled, Kevin. It's also controlled. What does that do to the American project? I mean, we tout that we are free and we are democratic and we are just. I'm wondering how we're viewed around the world now, just given this vigorous pursuit of and harassment and really the attempted killing of this man. Anytime our chief intelligence agency, they were going to kill him. And then you had some of the biggest people in our government who said, yeah, you should do that. Why?
Yeah. I mean, that's what vengeance will do to the souls, to the extent that they even still have souls while they are doing these jobs. One of the cases that I compared Julian Assange to, a lot of supporters would bring up this case, is because it's occupied a lot of attention for the corporate press or the establishment press. And I think rightfully so. I don't think this individual deserves to be detained. But maybe you've heard that in Russia, there's a Wall Street Journal reporter right now named Evan Gershkovich, who has been detained by Vladimir Putin. And Biden and others have gone to great lengths to try and pressure and get Russia to release him and return him to the country. But the allegation that Putin makes against Evan Gershkovich is that he was working for the CIA to collect, the word collect, he uses this word, to collect state secrets. And it would have been on the way that weapons were being manufactured by Russia for their war in Ukraine. And I look at this and I can't help but think, this is almost a mirror image. This is almost exactly what they accused Julian Assange of doing inappropriately. And the US government has no sense of what they're outraged over when they get angry at Russia. Because for the last 5 years before Julian Assange was free, everyone in the US government thought there was no problem with prosecuting Julian Assange. And what did he do at WikiLeaks? They were collecting state secrets that they believe were in the public interest. This was information the government does not want you to know, that we need to know so that we can maintain our human rights and our democracy. That's how WikiLeaks sold itself and why it was of interest to people, why it won awards, why it had a claim. And, I always said to people, I said, if you think that Evan Gershkovich needs to be freed, then you must be for freeing Julian Assange. But if you don't think Julian Assange should be freed, then there's a part of you that sort of has to admit that Putin has a right to keep our journalist in indefinite detention, or has the right to keep an American journalist in indefinite detention. And there are other cases around the world we've seen in India, in Pakistan, and I would argue in Israel, and then there's other countries that are more authoritarian and dictatorial in Europe. And they're like the Balkan states, and those like Azerbaijan, for example, where the US had no influence whatsoever. They lost their ability to say anything to these countries about how they treat their press because Julian Assange was detained in a UK prison, in a British prison that, by the way, was nicknamed and still has this nickname, Britain's Guantanamo. And so that's just something people need to chew over and really consider deeply of these cases as we engage in them. It means that the world sees us for who we are, and it forces us to really reckon with a kind of evil that is within our government.
Kevin Gosztola, the dissenter. Before I get closing thoughts from you, Kevin, because I have a feeling this is not going to end here. as we look at Mr. Gershkovich, and we do want him to come home, but we also want the CIA out of the media.
Well, I don't know. Just to be clear,
Well,
there's no proof ever put forward yet.
I'm saying not with him, but there are many reports now about the intelligence community. I mean, so my point is, and in academia, so it's easy to label. I mean, this endangers our people when they go around the country, because they can be easily accused, even if they're innocently doing research, innocently doing their jobs.
Yes.
As a journalist, your job as a journalist is to dig up stuff. And if you can't do it, because generally when you all come over here, you're doing this, well, my goodness, it just puts everybody in danger. But Dwight, I have a couple of minutes before it's closing thoughts from you before we close out with Kevin.
Well, I think that you all represent the best of the future. Your courage is amazing to me. It is what Dr. King and my generation had in mind when they really tried to invest the principles and the values of what real citizenship is and what real democracy is. And these successive generations, I know Cornell has spent his life trying to teach these principles in the colleges. And so it's very, very, very exciting for us and very satisfying for us to see you all grow up and assume the mantle that goes back hundreds of years, all the way to guys like Frederick Douglass, to guys like Mark Twain, who people don't know was a real crusader for justice.
And Ida B.
Who wanted to do the right thing, to Thoreau,
right,
who put his life on the line for a just cause.
Right.
And so I just want to applaud you all for maintaining that tradition and for being a role model for other people, these other young people who they themselves want to make an impact. And just encourage you all, but also let you know it's going to be a hard, intense struggle, because you're in the heart of the beast. You're fighting a very mighty enemy who will stop at nothing to get their way and nothing to break you. So I just say Godspeed and be of good courage, and maintain your integrity among all things.
Absolutely. I mean, there was an abrupt end to this deal. It seems like it came out of nowhere. And one has to wonder why, what happened. But you give us some closing thoughts. What should we be looking for? Because I certainly hope that that even though this was designed to put a chill in independent journalism, I hope that it won't. I have a feeling that it won't, because I don't see you stopping. I don't see other crusaders stopping, because if you stop this project that moves us toward democracy, that upholds a republic, that continues to change and evolve, it will end. You got to have a free and open press. Kevin Gastola, the last 2 minutes belong to you.
Well, my final thoughts, I'll just pick up with what Dwight's saying, and I'll speak to people who are even younger than me, and then I'm going to say a few words about independence. So, younger people, I know it's very daunting for you, and we're talking about the attacks that you can meet from your own government as you try to do your job. I know paired with that, there's also this issue of, how am I going to survive financially?
Yeah.
How is this going to give me an income? So not only do you have to worry about putting food on the table, your basic needs, but now we're telling you too, you have to worry about your own liberties, your own freedom. And that's daunting. But I would say we still need people to blaze a path in journalism. We need this press. We need it in a local setting more so than just in a national setting. I would say we need these community journalism projects in the city of Chicago, in areas that are smaller than the metropolitan area as well. Independence. Think about independence, because a lot of these institutions, organizations, they'll ask you for donations and they'll say they're independent journalism organizations. But if they're legacy media, if they're nonprofits, if they have access to money, are they really independent? Independent journalism is from people who are really working on limited amount of funds and don't have a lot of people to pull from other than their small readership. And they're beholden to them. I'm beholden to my readers, and I'm always doing what they want me to do. And I just ask people to think about that independence, because that independence is what got Julian Assange in trouble. He did not say that he was going to carry the torch for US foreign policy and try to help them achieve their agenda in the way that people at CNN or the New York Times do. And that got him in trouble.
Mhm.
And that's nothing, there's nothing wrong with that. As a journalist, you should be independent. You should cover the news without thinking about, I have to further a foreign policy or a domestic policy agenda of the powerful.
Well, you know, Kevin Goshtola, I thank you for your work. The dissenter.org. Freedom is not free. Support him. Support him. Support him. Freedom is not free. And my father, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, has often said, you cannot ride to freedom in Pharaoh's chariot. you got to pay for it. As you're watching now that you're seeing some journalists who are no longer on corporate TV, they're speaking. They've been freed up. It's been very interesting watching Chris Cuomo and his take on our health. I'll just put it that way, since he's no longer on CNN. And the pharmaceuticals are big sponsors of CNN. So there you have it. So if you really want to know what's going on, go to the dissenter.org, go to Defending Rights and Dissent. Please, they need your support. Get the book, Guilty of Journalism. It's the political case against Julian Assange. This was all political. Guilty of journalism, everybody. Remember, journalism is the only protected profession in our Constitution. And there's a reason for that. Because the government knew that they needed someone to keep them honest. Because if you lost their honesty and their integrity, those whom they governed would no longer allow them to stay in power. That's just the way it works. You rule by the consent of the governed. That's the way it is. But they have to trust you, and you need to be worthy of their trust. And real journalists keep us honest. That's right. Kevin, thank you so much. Cannot wait to have you back. We got a lot of stories to talk about. There's a lot that's going on, particularly as we get ready for this convention here in Chicago. So I want us to do some work together. Sending you so much love. Dwight McKee, of course, Dwight McKee, sending you so much love today. Thank you, AM 950 Radio. Hey, I hope you all enjoyed this new format. We keep trying new things, but here we are. I love my AM 950 Radio family, and I want to thank them for being so supportive of me as I've been getting my health together, but also in supporting this show. That having been said, we really wanted to interact with you live and in person. So this show will be broadcast in the morning from 6 to 8 on AM 950 Radio. But if you want to see today's show, go to the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel, everybody. Go there, because we had some really insightful pronouncements about what happened with this with this debate. We really had some wonderful insights from people. So we want to get your thoughts about that too. Sending you so much love today, Dwight McKee. God bless you. God bless you, everybody. Morning Stars, I love you. Remember, the Rainbow Push Convention is August 13th through the 17th. I want to see you all there. Of course, the next day is when the actual Democratic Convention begins. It's going to be great. And we want Rainbow Push at our headquarters at 930 East 50th Street to be a gathering place for people who are dissenters, people who are just concerned about the country and our world and their cities and their towns and their states and their counties, just the world in which we live. So can't wait to see you in Chicago, August 13th through the 17th, and really through the 21st, because we're going to be here hanging in there, broadcasting straight through the convention. I love you, everybody. God bless you. And see you soon. Dwight McKee, thank you so much. Everybody, I love you, love you, love you. I am